Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. I'm Jacob Shapiro, the Director of Geopolitical Analysis. Joining me as usual for our weekly wrap-up is Rob Larity, who is our Chief Investment Officer and Founder. It's been a quiet week in markets relatively to the last couple of weeks, and also in geopolitics. So we talk about the macro situation in the United States. We spend some time about Colombia's controversial elections, and then close off with a little bit of African swine fever. So thanks so much for listening. Please rate and review the podcast if you haven't already. Tell all your friends, send it everywhere. Cheers. We will see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, a beautiful Thursday morning here in New Orleans. How is it in Cambridge, Rob?
Well, as usual, it's pretty crappy, to be honest. You get about 7 days a year that are nice up here, and this is not one of them.
Well, I still never understand why people decided that was a good place for a place to live, but I guess things were different then. Let's dive in by talking a little bit about what's going on in markets. What's catching your macro eye today?
Well, not a whole lot. I think the way I would classify it is, in the prior few weeks, we spoke about things being at a bit of a turning point, and we mentioned a few weeks ago that we were getting more bullish and positioning accordingly. And so far, that seems to be playing out. We had right after we spoke last week, the market in the U.S. had one of its biggest, one-day rallies in quite a long time. And now the conversation is really about how durable that is and whether there will be follow-through. And the consensus seems to be that it's a bear market rally, which I don't know if that term is clear. But essentially, a small squiggle in the opposite direction in a market that's generally going down. So given that that's such a strong consensus, I think that probably means that it's not going to fizzle out anytime soon, because there's a lot of skepticism around it. So right now we're just sort of watching to see how much follow through there is, but I would expect this to last a bit longer than most people are probably assuming. So we will see.
One of the things the listeners don't get is they don't get to ask you questions when the microphones are off. And when we were prepping for this right before, and I said, "Hey, did you see the comments from Jamie Dimon about an economic hurricane on the horizon?" I don't think I can appropriately communicate to the listeners the extent to which you rolled your eyes with your words or with whatever sound it was you made when I raised that. But to your point, it does seem like the headline narrative right now is that this was just a blip, and that there does seem to be literally storm clouds on the horizon.
I think it brings up an interesting point, though, about Jamie Dimon, because he's obviously a very, very intelligent man, and but he occupies a different place in the ecosystem than we do. He's in a position where he has to say things for public consumption, and he's not managing a portfolio. He's managing a bank, but he doesn't have to be as forthright in many ways as we do, if that makes sense. So I don't know if I rolled my eyes at the comment. I think really my sentiment was, if you had to respond to everything that someone says in public, I mean, that's 90% of the news, and most of it just doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, that's true in markets, and it's true in geopolitics. Were there any other macro thoughts you wanted before we hop around the world a little bit?
Well, I think maybe starting in the U.S., the interesting thing right now is, there's this debate about how much we're going to slow down. I mean, the growth has clearly slowed, and certain people are more bearish, pointing to inflation and how that's crimping spending. The bulls are pointing to the fact that households' balance sheets are in pretty good shape. So there's this kind of tug of war going on. I guess the only contribution I would make that I think is a little bit different, or spinning it in a different way, is I think there's a misconception and there's a tendency to always fight the last war. And we're so accustomed after the last few cycles to thinking about kind of really deflationary downturns. And by that, I mean, when growth slows down, you see businesses slashing employment, you see investment really turning over hard because the economy and the private sector is really indebted. And that's sort of what we've seen, certainly in 2008, 2009, and then, in 2015 and obviously under COVID. But I'm not sure if that's really the norm. And I don't think that's going to be the norm in this case, because whether we go into a full-blown recession or whether it's just a growth slowdown and a more soft landing, as some people think, there's really not much evidence so far that we're seeing businesses behave in a similar way at all to the way they behaved in recent cycles, which is really constructive, I think, for society, because they're still investing. It's not necessarily good for those businesses' profit margins, but this notion where at the first hint of a downturn, businesses are going to slash all their employment and unemployment's going to be a problem, and that doesn't seem to be playing out at all so far, and that's good, more broadly. So
yeah, I mean, the sky does not seem to be falling. And I mean, another thing that you've been talking about lately that's been interesting to me is also we were talking just yesterday, I think, about the divergence between kind of the U.S. and Chinese economies. And even if the U.S. is slowing down, as you say, all signs out of China right now are that they're about to rip.
Yeah, and I think that just gets to what we've spoken about publicly, and we're writing this paper right now that we're going to release soon about geopolitics and investing and how that environment has changed, because you never saw such a divergence in major economies where, China is emerging from a downturn and the US is heading into a downturn and Europe is sort of somewhere in between. That was never the norm until very recently. And a large part of that is because policies are diverging, different levels of stimulus, different levels of government intervention. And that just makes the environment much more complex to navigate. And if you're not paying attention to what's going on individually in these different regions, then you're going to be at a loss, because everything doesn't just go up or down together anymore. So, in China, for instance, Chinese equities got absolutely clobbered before U.S. equities felt any sort of real pain last year. And now they're leading us out. If you look at the Chinese index or the index of Chinese tech stocks, that's been one of the strongest performers in the last week or two. So, these divergences are going to stick around, I think.
Well, and I think to your point, I mean, I bring up the China example just because it's so stark, because, I mean, the level of negativity about China in the last couple months has been, I mean, breathtaking in some ways. I chaired a panel for the Malden Economics Conference. I think that was that a month ago now? Time flies. And, it was me, and they had me do this panel with four other China experts, and my job was to moderate the panel. And it was actually a really difficult panel to moderate, because they all thought the same thing, which was that the sky was falling for China and that China was uninvestable and that things were terrible. And I think the COVID lockdowns in Shanghai had everybody saying, look, all these companies are going to run for the hills and China's not going to be able to handle this. And the whole economy is going to go belly up. And Xi and Premier Li are facing off against each other in a power struggle. I even had a contact text me this morning with the age-old question, will China invade Taiwan? And I said, no, they're not, for the 500th time. But this week also, like, Shanghai's open for business again. After 2 months, everybody's out. They're going to restaurants. They had fireworks and parties and stuff like that. I mean, all the doom and gloom prognosticators for the past couple months, they've all gone away, right? Like, they're not talking about it. China's now kind of come out the other side with more stimulus than they even applied in 2020. So I'm wondering if you're going to get a little 2008 type effect, which was the last time that China really took out this level of stimulus to try and get growth figures going again.
Well, let's hope not 2008, because that would be pretty counterproductive, to say the least. Yeah. That's the big bazooka for sure.
Well, it's looking like a pretty big bazooka to me. But I think to your point though, it's bad long term for the Chinese economy. I think the Chinese economy was trying to rationalize itself, and things got a little too dicey. I think the Chinese Communist Party blinked. And Xi was basically like, all right, like we can't let growth go this low, guys. I wasn't even expecting it to go this low. We're going to have to do something a little different. So I think that's the phase we're in with them.
Frankly, I'm a little surprised by all this because, I know you read Michael Pettis, and I think he's probably the clearest analyst on these issues of China's need to rebalance and really, excess savings and underconsumption and all those things that are just sort of leading them further into a hole that eventually is going to, require a reckoning. And the odds were always against sort of a voluntary, painful restructuring or a voluntary, painful reorganization of the economy, just because there's so many powerful interests against that. The people who benefited from the former model, which is, all about fixed asset investment and real estate and infrastructure and all these things that stopped being really productive at the margin probably 10 years ago. But I did think that there was more hope than we've seen that she would try to address these problems using some of his newfound power. And we really haven't seen that at all. And that's surprising and a little worrisome for the longer term, at least.
Well, I think he tried. I mean, it's the old Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. I mean, China got punched in the mouth, and it got punched in the mouth a couple different times, and it took a couple different punches for them to do it. But I mean, think about the real estate bubble and the way that he really did kind of rein in the real estate problem and dangled out there that some of these real estate companies that defied him were not going to be bailed out by the Chinese government. I mean, the COVID situation changed that a little bit, but I mean, I do think he has tried. I think there's a certain limit to what the Communist Party thinks China can handle, and for whatever reason, this COVID-19 shutdown triggered that limit, and that's why I think you're seeing China go back to the sort of fiscal stimulus model.
Mm-hmm.
What else? It's actually been I shouldn't say a quiet week geopolitically. Nothing is really quiet when the Russia-Ukraine war continues to go on. But I think one of the more interesting things that happened in the past week were Colombia's elections, which actually happened last Sunday. Colombia works like most Latin American countries, where if you don't get 50% of the vote in the first round, you go to a round two. And the number one candidate was with about 40% of the vote was a quote unquote leftist. I hate that shorthand, but there's not a lot of better shorthand for it. Maybe we can break that apart. Petro sort of got 40%, but coming in second was Rodolfo Hernandez, who calls himself the king of TikTok, and some people are calling him the Trump of Colombia. He's another one of these rich guys who decided he wanted to go into politics and lament the corruption of the system, even though he is himself under investigation for corruption. And it seems like the center right in Colombia is coalescing around him. And I just did an interview this morning where I was being asked what's going on in Colombia. So I think that's some big news. And Colombia is not a country that we've really talked about here yet.
And what sort of takeaways do you think there are from that for the broader region, if any?
Well, the first thing is that I think people don't appreciate that Colombia is arguably the closest U.S. ally in all of Latin America. And if you look at a map, it's really clear why. Colombia sits right next to Panama and right next to the Panama Canal, and it is one of those Caribbean states like Venezuela, like Panama, like Cuba, where if a foreign power was able to project influence there, it could cause real problems for the United States. I mean, the United States depends on the Panama Canal to be both an Atlantic and a Pacific power at the same time, especially from a naval perspective. And then you move a little bit further north to Cuba, and if there's a country that can block U.S. exports out of the Mississippi River complex, now we're talking about existential threats to the United States. So if you just look at a map, that's why Colombia is important. Specifically for the U.S. and why U.S. officials, I think, will be watching this. In terms of regionally, I don't know how much importance it's going to have. I was actually surprised when I was looking at Colombia's trade figures because I had to sort of update myself on them. They export a certain amount of oil, but that's really it. It's oil and coffee and some other commodities, but not a lot of other advanced manufacturing and not really plugged into a lot of the region. Most of their trade is U.S., Mexico, and then maybe some China. So I'm not sure that economically it's going to have that big of a deal. I think the bigger issue is that no matter who wins, whether it's Petro or Hernandez, these are both anti-establishment candidates, and it's a real rejection of the status quo. And I don't think it's going to be a Venezuela type situation, which is the way I've seen it reduced in a lot of media, because that's all any writer seems to think about is Venezuela when you have a quote unquote leftist polling well in a Latin American country. But the scenario I think that is more likely is what's happened in Peru, because either Petro or Hernandez, no matter who wins in the runoff in a couple of weeks, they're going to face a divided Congress, and they're not going to be able to do anything legislatively. And so there's just going to be dysfunction and uncertainty in Colombia going forward. And I just don't have a high confidence interval in what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. And uncertainty is bad. I guess in all of these sorts of ways.
And do you think this reflects? I mean, because we had a pretty left oriented president in Chile, and in Brazil we have an election coming up in the autumn. Does this reflect a broader trend, do you think? And what can we think about with regard to Lula in Brazil in light of this, if anything? Or is that just a completely different situation?
No, I don't think it's a completely different situation. And there are things I think we can take from it. But I'm a little contrarian here. I hate the left-right divisions because they really don't mean anything anymore. I mean, it used to mean communist versus liberal, and the U.S. versus the Soviets in the context of the Cold War. I mean, we could go all the way back to the French Revolution for the initial sort of definitions of right and left. But what we're seeing right now, it's not your daddy's leftism. Gabriel Boric, who you mentioned in Chile, is a wonderful example where, yes, he has some very socially liberal policies that would normally be sort of associated with the left. And yes, he thinks about redistributive policies in some sense when it comes to economics. But fiscally, he's pretty conservative, almost hawkish. Chile has been one of the most hawkish countries fighting inflation since the beginning, and that hasn't changed since he's come to office. And if you look at some of the cabinet officials that he picked specifically for finance or for trade and things like that, you're not dealing with somebody who looks like he goes to bed reading the Communist Manifesto. It's really more traditional than that. So I think there's this new kind of generation that's coming up that is a little more socially liberal, that maybe even is still kind of fiscally conservative, and they're trying to find their way forward. The trend I think that is coming up that is worrying for a country like Colombia or a country like Brazil is that we're getting a rise of populism and populist politics. And whether it's, Bolsonaro is a right-wing populist, and Lula, I would argue, is a left-wing populist. It's the same in Colombia. This Petro guy is a left-wing populist And Hernandez is a right-wing populist. And populism, to me, is really about short-term political thinking, about bread and circuses, and about giving people what they want in the moment, about preying on fears rather than about sort of sober policy and long-term kind of thinking. And that, I think, is the disturbing thing going forward, because there is a lot of that kind of populism and that kind of short-term thinking. And that, I think, is destructive, especially for Latin American economies, because the story of Latin America is governments that come into power that don't think long term, that just take the commodity money and run, and then you get these awful boom bust cycles. So if you can't break that cycle, you're just consigned to being, a commodity depot for foreign powers, and eventually, when commodity demand goes down, you're going to be screwed.
Well, let me ask a question on that, because it almost seems like there's a contradiction in what you just said, or at least an interesting pointing in two different directions. Because on the one hand, you noted that the leftists aren't that leftist anymore, and most candidates appear to have kind of moved to the center on fiscal things, which argues to sort of a stability and underlying satisfaction with the way things are going. There's no call for nationalizing industries and wholesale confiscation and stuff like that. And that at the same time, you point out the rise of populism, which isn't just in Latin America, obviously, but it's been very prominent there. And, that being about short-termism and, bread today, starving tomorrow kind of policies. How do you reconcile those two things? Because that would suggest almost like a move away from stability and away from kind of a satisfaction with the status quo and longer term thinking. Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
I think so. Well, I guess for me, it's hard to see. I don't really see the contradiction in those things. I mean, I think when it comes to, we were talking about Brazil. Brazil is an excellent example. Bolsonaro wants to cap the price of fuel. So here's Bolsonaro, like he's the pro-business guy. He's the one who was going to make sure that Brazil privatized and was going to be able to capitalize on all of its economic advantages. And yet all he really wants is to keep fuel prices low. And Lula, like when he's debating with Bolsonaro, when he's giving his interviews right now, he's saying, and you know what? I'm going to keep fuel prices even lower. That's what I'm going to do. And this Bolsonaro guy is also crazy. If we go back to the Colombian context, and actually I should have also added that climate change and the approach towards environmentalism also seems to be a part of whatever's happening here. And in some ways, the political lines are not well drawn here. So the most anti-investment position of Petro, this Colombian quote unquote leftist candidate, is that he wants to end all Colombian oil exploration. And that's bad because Colombia, something like 45% of Colombia's exports are oil, and oil prices are up, and everybody wants oil right now. And I would argue that's a silly policy. It's actually probably bad for Colombia. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That said, one of Colombia's problems is that it's too dependent on commodity exports. He has the right idea. He just has to figure out how to translate that into policy. So, that's the needle to thread. It's, again, one of the reasons I come back to Chile as a country that I'm more optimistic about, because even there, their political process resulted in very different candidates, but also very different ideas about policy and how to implement them. Not sort of, I'm going to give you cheap fuel, or I'm going to tax the 4,000 wealthiest Colombians. There's some of that in the system, but the person who's actually leading the movement is not thinking that way, is thinking more pragmatically. So, in some ways, all politics is populist. Like, you have to be able to make people feel like you're going to take care of them. But I think one of the interesting things that's happening specifically in Latin America is it doesn't matter whether they're left or right or socially liberal or environmentally conscious or friendly. It's all the same playbook. It's all, hey, we're going to prey on your fears. We're going to talk about inequality. We're going to try and fix things now. There's none of that. There's not a real sense of patience, if that makes sense. But maybe I'm contradicting myself. I agree with you that I'm saying that it's a short-termism thing. Where am I saying that it's positive longer term?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is when people are more susceptible to populist messages, it seems to suggest that there's a dissatisfaction, that people are unhappy. And that makes sense to me. Like, I have a good amount of Brazilian friends. And if you hear them talk about what's happening in Brazil, they're extremely pessimistic and extremely dissatisfied. And of course, there's a selection bias because most of the Brazilians I speak with have ties to the US or they've come to the US. So those sorts of people are naturally going to be more dissatisfied. But I can see in an environment like that where populism would thrive, easy solutions, quick fixes, not feeling confident that you can implement long-term policies that are thoughtful and rational and that are going to, pay out over time. And yet what I'm really asking is, like, at the same time, you're seeing a real moderation in terms of fiscal approaches. So you would expect more radical economic policies, more radical social leveling, more radical state intervention. And that doesn't seem to be really catching on. And that's what I find puzzling or curious, is have those ideas been so discredited that even in an environment where people are willing to, listen to whatever crazy thing Bolsonaro is going to say, that at the same time, they know that nationalizing the mining industry and the more extreme proposals that some people have put out there aren't really what they want, nevertheless.
Yeah, I see what you're saying now. I mean, so yes, like, and I think in that sense, that's another reason why it's hard to call. I mean, some of these leaders are flat out leftists. Like if Pedro Castillo in Peru didn't have to deal with the Peruvian Congress, I bet he would nationalize every single industry he could get his hands on and start redistributing things. The issue, though, is that he's a singular charismatic candidate who managed to translate disillusionment and dissatisfaction with the status quo into one election victory. But one political leader, it really takes a very specific constellation of circumstances to translate that into actual broad-scale change. And in some cases, it also takes policy experience. Castillo is also a great example of what happens when a political novice gets involved at the national level and starts trying to move pieces around, and you're blocked and there's too many constraints. So I think you're right in that kind of leftism, like classic leftism, has been discredited. And it's not like anybody's voting for these candidates because they want their industries nationalized. They're voting for these candidates because inequality is rising, because the food prices are rising, because they feel like corruption is on the rise, or poverty. Colombia is a great example where both poverty and violence are on the rise, and nobody's been doing anything about it. Latin American countries are also countries that didn't do well in globalization because China basically soaked up all the interest that was supposed to come to them, and it's all finally coming back around. But this is also part of where the problem is, because you're getting these populist leaders, but then they're facing off against legislative branches that are more traditional, and there's really no way for them to actually enact policy. And if all you're going to get is dysfunction, the situation is just going to get worse, and it's going to spiral until you actually get critical mass towards real types of change. So it's why a situation like Colombia is actually, to me, pretty worrying, because you have these two leaders who are elected on platforms that are just diametrically opposed to what's going to be possible in Congress. So they've gotten everybody's hopes up, and they're going to fall flat on their faces. And that, I think, is just going to produce more dissatisfaction, and there's going to be no escape valve for that going forward. Does that make sense? Is that a better way of putting it?
No, I think it does. And where do you think that ultimately leads to? So, like in Chile, Boric was elected in December, and his approval ratings have already plummeted. And he's, moderated his views on, or at least moderated what he's attempted to do, because he's had to in some ways. and partially because he's chosen to. Where does that ultimately take us, do you think? Do you think that you get a more radical Congress at some point? Or do you see people becoming frustrated because they elect national leaders who promote more radical policies and more radical change, and the legislatures are just naturally more conservative as far as enacting change of both kinds? Like, where does that end up?
It really depends on the country. I mean, in Chile, they're also, they've just gotten the draft of their constitution. They're going to vote on it in a couple months. I saw one poll that said, a majority of people, not a majority, I think a plurality of Chileans would vote against the constitution right now. It was 39% to 31%. But all the rest of that percent going up to 100 is undecided. So in Chile, in some sense, you're getting that kind of catharsis. If they pass a new constitution, you're saying, okay, we've actually thought about the structure. We've thought about where we want to be going forward. We've had a chance to express ourselves, not just at the ballot box, but in the way that our political framework is fundamentally designed. Peru can't do that. Castillo wants a constitutional referendum or a change to the constitution. He can't get it because nobody wants it. It's not going to happen in Colombia either. So I think in some ways, the places where you're seeing real change, that's actually good. That's actually the system responding in a way that it will ultimately be constructive. Just because things are going bad doesn't mean that things are going to go bad long term. And in some ways, the countries that can make those tough decisions in the short term, kind of to bring it back to the China part of the conversation, that'll probably help them out in the long term. Whereas countries like Peru, or now it looks like Colombia, are not able to make those sorts of changes, where they're just going to be in this hamster wheel of, who's the guy who attracts the most votes right now, even though he has no system or no framework or no policy kind of thing behind him. Things could be worse there. Another country that I'm getting relatively more optimistic about from this perspective is Mexico. Mexico, which had, AMLO, who is a major populist who came in and had a little bit of power there for a while, but there's nobody coming after him, and the people that are going to come after him are probably going to be able to deal with things a little bit more pragmatically than he was. And in some ways, it's actually the evolution of Mexican democracy from just 2 or 3 parties to parties that are actually representing more Mexicans' influence and having that expressed in the Mexican government. So, it's really country to country. Some countries like Chile, like Mexico, like even Brazil, I think this can be a positive thing for. Other countries like Peru and maybe Colombia, they're not showing the ability to translate some of that dissatisfaction into change. It just looks like dissatisfaction is going to beget more dissatisfaction.
And here's a sort of hypothetical question. So would you rather be long, and I don't mean this in the stock market sense per se, because these places don't have stock markets, but just in general, would you rather be long Colombia and Peru, or would you rather be long Venezuela and Cuba from the starting point of today? That's the 2 tag team matchups.
Yeah. Well, can I say long Cuba, Peru?
No, you can't mix them up.
Can I mix them up? I mean, Venezuela will eventually kind of come out of its funk, but there's a lot that has to happen before Venezuela can turn things around. I think Cuba's closer to being at the point where it might be able to turn, and the U.S. is going to be more interested in doing so. Peru, I'm more just straight pessimistic about. Things just don't look good to me there. Colombia, I would say I'm honestly kind of neutral. It's too uncertain for me to have a really high confidence interval, because Colombia does have a lot of things going for it. It's got really good strategic geography. It's got a tight relationship with the United States. It has oil. It has some of these commodities. If it could put some of the pieces together, it's an alluring emerging market from that point of view. The problem is just that you also have all this uncertainty now and all of this sort of government dysfunction, and it seems like there's only more to come. So I have trouble generating any kind of high confidence interval on where Colombia is going. If you told me in 5 years, Colombia had been able to put this all to bed, and that one of these candidates actually was more pragmatic than he was on the campaign trail and was able to usher in a new era of Colombian politics, I'd believe you. If you told me that this was the beginning of Colombia circling down the drain, I'd believe you too. Like, both of those scenarios are very present. So I'm copying out of the answer to your question. I think all things being equal, I would take the risk on Cuba and Venezuela than I would on Peru and Colombia, even though those are the safer bets.
Let me teach you a lesson. It's better to say you're hedging than you're copping out. That always sounds better.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm very expertly and strategically hedging my position there by. Rob, before we close, I think we should just spend 5 minutes talking about this African swine fever vaccine that you found. I didn't even find it today, but Vietnam announced today that in coordination with some U.S. researchers that they have an African swine fever vaccine. For listeners who probably don't spend their time thinking about animal viruses, ASF does not affect humans, so you don't need to worry about another pandemic, but it is extremely destructive to pigs. And has single-handedly destroyed, entire pork industries in places like Russia, like China, the Philippines. A lot of countries in Asia have had problems with ASF in the last couple of years. So it's a really big deal if you can get an African swine fever vaccine. The deputy agricultural minister for Vietnam said that apparently the vaccine confers 6 months of immunity, so it's not kind of a perfect decision. Or a perfect vaccine in that sense, but it does at least shield, your hog herd from that virus, and over time you could protect yourself from it. And there's been so much pressure on sort of the pork protein industry over the last couple of years due to ASF. This is just such a big deal, and I'm wondering if it's going to kick off a new era of vaccine diplomacy or vaccine wars between the U.S. and China, because you can bet China's going to want access to that vaccine, and something tells me the U.S. isn't going to be happy about giving it to them.
Yeah, I'm looking up the numbers while you're talking, because this was such a huge deal several years ago when China had to cull, I believe it was 1/3 of its entire pig herd.
I think it ended up being like a half, but it was tens. It was like the greatest pig holocaust of the of all time.
1.2 million pigs, it says here, in 2019 alone, which I forget what the numbers were offhand, but if you just think of that in terms of pounds of animals, it was the most extraordinary reduction in agricultural livestock that I think we've ever seen. So it's truly hard to overstate how big it is. And it really threw the whole Chinese livestock industry and pork industry into turmoil, and really led to a lot of accelerated professionalization and scaling up and better technology, because as recently as 5 years ago, the pig farmers were predominantly small family farms, not very sophisticated, and a lot of those guys just went away. So
I'd even go one step further and say that, the African swine fever epidemic in China it got really, really bad in 2019, at the same time that the Trump administration and China were in negotiations over the trade war, and eventually what became the phase 1 U.S.-China trade deal came out of those negotiations. But that was actually one of the things that made China extremely distrustful of the United States, because they were pretty open about the fact that they had this African swine fever epidemic in the country. And rather than offer help, the United States used that as a negotiating tool. They said, well, since you have this epidemic, we're going to require that you buy even more U.S. pork. And Chinese access to the U.S. pork market has been a problem spot for U.S.-China trade relations going back to even the Obama administration. And I haven't been able to prove this, but one of my suppositions is that was actually maybe what made China a lot less willing to disclose information about what was happening in Wuhan at the end of 2020 and even into early 2021. I think China felt like they had this new virus on their hands, and they were worried that the United States was going to use it against them in some fundamental way. So they were more secretive about it than they might have been even a couple years ago. So the African swine fever thing, it's going to affect like pork prices, kind of in the long term over the next couple of years if this vaccine is for real. But I think it's also an interesting lesson in the unintended consequences of how even these things that you don't think are important eventually come back to bite us at a geopolitical level.
And I know recently you've been writing about food a lot, and we talked about this last week. And one of the points that you've made was that, of course, it's a race in terms of science and technology against, weather and other issues. How does this kind of impact that thesis? I mean, you have this massive, massive problem that has been addressed very quickly. Is that making you more optimistic about our ability to innovate our way out of food shortages or issues like that in the future? Or do you think this is a separate issue?
That's a good question. I mean, if you bet against technological advances in sort of agriculture over the last 100 or 200 years, and in the long term, you were always on the wrong side of that trade. I mean, we've always seemed to be able to find a way to push more yield out of smaller acres, or even beyond meat and going beyond animal protein into some of these plant-based proteins or lab-based proteins. I mean, when you think about the level of innovation that's there, it's hard to bet against it in that sense. I would also say, though, and it's going to take years, I think, for this vaccine to really be produced at scale, to be delivered, for it to really start affecting the pork industry. But you might also then see a real increase in demand for feed, which is going to put pressure on already pretty constrained grain market prices. So I'm not an expert on agricultural technology, so I can't claim to have any special insight there. I can just say that, if you look over the past 200 years, we have always seemed to find a way to innovate ourselves out of our problems. I think the more operative thing, and we don't know exactly what the science is behind this vaccine, but between the COVID-19 vaccine and now this ASF vaccine, we seem to be producing vaccines at a higher level. And it definitely seems like biotech has not only become geopolitical, but it's going to become an increasingly important part of national power and of economics. And we're going to have solutions on the table there from that sector that before would have taken decades minimum to produce these types of advances.
And here's a stupid question. Why is Vietnam the one taking the lead on this? I would have expected, a Chinese company, but it's this Navitco company, which is a publicly traded company, apparently, that developed it in conjunction with the USDA.
Well, China, as we've seen from the COVID vaccine situation, their companies are not exactly mature or mature. It's not surprising to me that, China's been trying to do this, but it's not surprising to me that they weren't the ones to crack the code. As to why Vietnam, I have no earthly clue. I wonder if the U.S. is letting them take credit, or if there was some kind of deal behind the scenes, or it might also be that the U.S. has been really tightly controlling its borders because it didn't want any ASF in the U.S. itself. So maybe the U.S. just wasn't even willing to experiment with this, and they needed, a friendly country in which to experiment, and Vietnam became the one because they already had an outbreak. But I really don't know. It's very interesting that Vietnam is the one leading the way here, because you don't think of Vietnam as a biotech champion. You think of them as, where companies are going to manufacture their shoes and other sort of lower end products because they're leaving China. So I don't have a good answer for you on that one, but I imagine it has something to do with the U.S. Wanting Vietnam to take the credit, or not being able for some reason to do some of the research at home.
Well, Vietnam is a place to watch for sure.
It is one of the. I like countries like Vietnam because even the experts on Vietnam, we have very limited access to information about what's going on inside the Vietnamese Politburo. So it's sort of like North Korea. If anybody tells you they know exactly what's going on in Vietnam or in North Korea, you can just turn them off right there, because nobody does. It's really a lesson in how to just read the macro fundamentals and see what's going on, rather than having any special insider information.
Well, shall we close it there?
Should we call it a wrap? All right.
We'll end with the pigs.
We'll end with the pigs. Thanks, Rob. And we'll do this in person next week. That'll be exciting.
Yeah, that would be fun. All right. Thanks, Jacob.
Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.